I'm so excited to be here, man. It's really kind of surreal to get introduced by my brother. I love my brother, but every time we're together and I go up to somebody and I say, hey, yeah, my name's Hunter Bezet and this is my brother, I usually get like an audible, wow. How did he get all the good genes in the family? And my question is, I don't know, but at least I'm more athletic than him. And I beat him in everything that we ever competed in. I'm very thankful for that. I'm so excited to be here. I love being in Greenbrier, but this is where I grew up. I grew up in this town, went to high school here, so to kind of get a chance to come back and to talk to you guys tonight, I've been looking forward to this. My dad asked me to speak several months ago, and ever since then, I've been really excited about it, and now it's here. And I do just want to give you guys a quick little update on my life because it's changed a little bit since the last time Katie and I were here in Conway. I've got a couple of pictures for you guys. This is my beautiful family that is growing. That is my beautiful wife, Katie, that I love dearly, and that is our son. His name's Jackson Richard. Both of our dad's names are Richard, so we had to throw that in there. It was just too easy to make them both happy, and there he is. He is the happiest little man. And then today at Serve Day, all across the state, different churches serve, and he even got involved trying to help my wife put a stool together. Sorry about the diaper showing there in that picture. Man, I'm so excited to be here, and I look at those pictures and I think back to when we just kind of found out that we were going to be having a baby, and everybody thinks that my dad is hilarious, and my dad he's a very funny man, but he's not the funniest person in our family because my dad had to get it from somebody. And the person that my dad got it from is actually his dad, my pawpaw. My pawpaw is just one of the funniest people I have ever been around in my entire life. And right when we found out that Katie and I were going to have a child, a few days after that, my pawpaw, he calls me on the phone. And I answered it, and my pawpaw sounded frantic over the phone. And he's like, Hunter, I got to know something. Pawpaw, what's going on? Why, you okay? He said, Hunter, I got to know something. I said, all right, Pawpaw, what do you got to know? He said, I got to know, is it going to be a boy or is it going to be a girl? So, Pawpaw, I don't know. It's going to be a couple of months before we know. Why do you have to know so bad? He said, because I got to know if I'm going to be a grandpa or a grandma. That's my Pawpaw, man. But I also think back to those times, and I think back when people were asking me, Hunter, do you want a boy or a girl? And I was always telling everybody, I want a boy. I want a boy. I want a boy so stinking bad. I remember in the ultrasound room, we found out it was a boy. The nurse told us that it was a boy, and I jumped up and screamed at the top of my lungs and scared our poor nurse because I was so excited that it was a boy. But I also think back to whenever I really wanted a boy, and I started thinking about, like, why did I really care? Like, why did I care so much? And how often in our lives do we try to affect what we're supposed to do and what we're supposed to be and what's supposed to happen? How often in our lives do we try to fulfill our own purposes instead of letting God fulfill our own purposes? How often do we fight for what we think is best for us instead of allowing our Creator to be the one that's fighting for us? There's a verse in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 21. It says, many are the plans in a man's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. A few years ago, I found all of this out firsthand. I found out how hard in my life I was going to fight to get my own purposes to prevail, and then how hard in life God was going to fight for me. About 6 years ago, I was further from God than I have ever been in my entire life. Without getting too detailed, I'll just tell you guys that I was working on my testimony pretty hard. And as I was doing that, I would disappear from my parents' house for days at a time. And I just wouldn't call them or text them and tell them where I was. And I would go and I would sleep on different people's couches, and they would always be worried about me. And finally one day, my dad had had enough, and he gave me way more grace than I deserved. But he calls me on the phone, and I just so happened to be at my parents' house when he called me, and he said, Hunter, I'm done with this. I'm sick of not knowing where you are. When we come home, I don't want you to be there anymore. I want you to move out. And when you're in those moments like where you're so prideful and you so want to prove to everybody that you can do life on your own, you're not going to let other people know when something that they say really hurts. And when my dad said that, it hurt me, but I wasn't going to tell him that that was the case. So I just said, whatever, I don't like living here anyway, and I hung up the phone. But then I'm walking through the house and I'm trying to think to myself, what am I going to do? How am I going to survive? And then I started thinking, well, now I know that my dad, it was probably his idea for me to move out, but my mom, she probably doesn't want me to. So what can I take from my parents' house that is going to make them miss me a lot? And you tell me the mind of a 19-year-old kid. And so I start walking through the house and I start trying to figure out what can I take? And I walk into my bedroom and I see my mattress on my bed. And I thought, that's it. I don't know where it came from, but I decided I'm going to take the mattress. And so I walk in there and I take the mattress, because in my mind, I thought if I take the mattress, every time my mom walks by the room, she's going to see that there's a bed in there without a mattress. It's going to make her think of me. Then she's going to get mad at my dad and I'm going to win. Okay, like that was my thought process. And so I took the mattress and I called a friend of mine who had a trailer, and he brings his trailer over and we load the mattress up, and I get in the car and he says, okay, where to? I don't know. I got no clue. And I remembered I had a friend who had a barn, and in his barn he had a loft that he rarely ever went to. So I thought, well, I'll just take the mattress to that barn and I'll put it up there in that loft. That way, like if I need somewhere to sleep, and just in case this whole finding my own way thing doesn't work out, I'll have this awesome mattress in this barn. And so we took it and we put it upstairs in the loft of this barn. And then it just so happened that not long after that, I lost my job and I started struggling, and people didn't want me sleeping on their couches as much anymore. And I started sleeping in this loft on this mattress more and more often. And then one night I got a phone call from somebody who every now and then would give me a job. And the job would be I would have to drive a big old dually truck just somewhere random as soon as he called me. And this night he called me at 9 o'clock at night and said, Hunter, I need you to run a part down south of Dallas. Can you do it? And I said, yes. So I got in the car and I drove all night long. About 9 or 10 o'clock the next morning, I'm finally about to be home. And I'm coming around on this old country road, and I'm the kind of person, I don't know if anybody else in here is like this, but I'm the kind of person that always drives 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. And I came behind somebody that was driving 10 miles an hour under the speed limit. And I'm way too talented of a driver to go that slow. So I get behind this person, and then we would come around this corner, and there's a double yellow line, but it was more of a suggestion. So I decided to go around on the outside of that double yellow line in front of that car. And when I did, it ticked the person in the car off. And so they got right up on my bumper. And then I decided I'm going to show them how I can really drive. So I threw that thing down into low gear, and I took off. And I'm driving through these back roads, and I'm losing this car behind me, and I got about one more turn to go before I get to make it home to my barn and go to sleep. And right before I take the turn, I look in the rearview mirror one last time, and in the car behind me, on their rearview mirror, there was a little strip of blue lights flashing. Yeah, everybody knows that feeling. And you have like that split-second thought of, should I run? No is the answer every time. And I pulled over on the side of the street. This cop comes in behind me, and he's ticked off. He's mad, and he gets out of his car. He says, your truck's gone. Sit on the curb. I ain't sitting on the curb. You can have my truck, but I'm not going to sit on the curb. And I'm standing there, and he's, give me your driver's license. I gave him my driver's license, and as soon as he looked at my driver's license, I could tell that he recognized my name. He said, are you Rick Bezet's boy? Dadgummit. Yes, I am. He said, I want you to call him right now. I haven't talked to my dad in months. This is the last thing I want to call him about. And I remembered he's out of the country. I can't call him. So I told the cop, I said, sir, he's not even in the country. Sorry, I can't call him. He said, all right, that's fine. I want you to call your mom instead. Dadgummit, that's even worse, man. And so I called my mom. I hadn't talked to her in months. And I told her I just got pulled over by a cop. And my mom comes and she picks me up and she takes me like the half a mile to get home to my awesome barn. And now all of a sudden, my mom is seeing me, what's really going on in my life. The last person that I thought any shred of pride I had left with. She's seeing me in this barn, and she's seeing where my life's at, and I was so angry. And my mom, she looked over at me and she said, "Hunter, I hope you know how much God loves you." And when she said that, it ticked me off. Made me so mad. Said some things to my mom in the car that I regret till the day that I die. I hurt my mom. And I got out of the car and I slammed the door shut and I walked away. I went and I got inside and I was so mad that she said that. And it wasn't until a little while later before I realized what she was actually talking about and what she was referring to in the Bible. But this is what I want you guys to know, is that I had settled living a life that I thought that I wanted. Like I had settled living a life that I had created for myself. I thought that what I had wanted and what I could do on my own was way better than what God wanted for me in my life. And this is what is so important, and that is that Jesus did not come and die and then raise from the dead so that you and I can live average, mediocre lives. He came and he died and he got up and he got out of that grave so that you and I can get up and get out of whatever we're going through in our lives as well. He showed us how to do it. He didn't come so that we can all of a sudden go to work on a Monday morning and all we're thinking about is getting off of work on Friday afternoon, because that's when our real life gets to start. No, God came and Jesus came and he died for you and for me so that we can live a life abundantly and that we can do it prosperously through him. Galatians 5:1 says that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Jesus came and he died for you and for me for no other reason than he wanted us to be free. And he wanted us to have peace. He wanted us to have him. And yet, how many times do we try to gain our own purpose and our own freedom? So today, we're going to be learning from a guy in the Bible that you may have heard of, maybe you haven't. Don't worry, I'm going to try to explain as much of the story to you as I can. But if you brought your Bibles, turn with me to Judges chapter 6. We're going to be learning about a guy named Gideon. And if you want to learn more about him, you can read the whole story on your own time. It's Judges chapter 6 through chapter 8. But Gideon, if you don't know, he was the guy who took 300 men and conquered an entire nation. Took 300 men and conquered a nation of tens of thousands. And an entire army that had been oppressing Israel for a really long time. And he shows up and he sets them free. He accomplished more in his lifetime than most big dreamers could ever even dream about. But his life didn't start out that way. In fact, Gideon's life started off way differently. So I want us to look at how God's purpose gave Gideon true freedom. Number one, we got to know that God's plan is the key to unlocking freedom in our lives and in your life. Here's an obvious statement. When you are in a trap, your potential is trapped as well. In fact, it may even feel like you don't have any potential. Some of you in here, you've been trapped for a long time, so much so that you don't even feel like you have any potential left on the inside of you. And God's trying to tell you tonight that that is not true. So I want to start off reading a little bit of the story in Judges chapter 6, verse 11. You can follow along with me or you can look up here, but this verse, it starts off by saying that the angel of the Lord. And I want to stop right there because right there when it says the angel of the Lord, many scholars believe that this was not an angel, that this was actually Jesus. And there's a reason I'm pointing this out to you because later on I'm going to talk about the way that I think this is Jesus and why I'm sure that this is Jesus that's showing up in this story. But Gideon actually later on refers to this moment as being God, and even later on in the Bible, it refers to this moment as it being Jesus. So, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite. where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. All right, so Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. We're going to unpack this verse for just a second for learning's sake. If you don't know what threshing wheat is or what a winepress is, and I would have a feeling that most of us do not, you probably wouldn't understand that verse. But if you were a Hebrew, especially back in these times, and you're reading this verse, you would probably laugh a little bit, and you would also probably want to cry a little bit because you were understanding what was going on. So we're going to unpack this because Katie and I, we got a chance to go to Israel just over a year ago, and I actually got to see a wine press for the first time in my life that they were referring to right here in this story. And a wine press is where they would take all the grapes from the vineyard and they put it down on this bedrock. Bedrock had to be one solid stone down deep in the ground, and then they would come out and they would stomp on the grapes to make wine. But it was a hole in the ground. It was this big old hole in the ground. And what Gideon was doing is he was threshing wheat down in this wine press. And the process of threshing wheat is basically just cleaning the wheat. See, when you go out and you harvest wheat, wheat has dirt all on it. And the best way for them to clean the dirt off of the wheat is for them to thresh it. And so what they do is they take a pitchfork and they put the pitchfork into the wheat and they throw the wheat up in the air. And then wind comes by and it blows the dirt and the dust off of the wheat. And when the wheat comes back down, it's clean. They're then able to eat the wheat or sell it for a higher price. And so that is what Gideon is doing in this moment, is he is threshing this wheat, but he is doing it in a wine press. Why is that important? Because the key ingredient to threshing wheat is wind. And I don't know if you've ever been down in a hole before, but there's not a whole lot of wind in a hole. And so Gideon is down in this wine press and he's doing a task that has absolutely no meaning and is completely pointless. And he's throwing this wheat and this dust up in the air, and then wheat and dust and dirt are falling back down. And then he's throwing the wheat back up in the air, and then the wheat and the dust are falling back down to the ground over and over and over again. He's caught up in a meaningless and pointless life. And this is a tough place to be. How do I know this? Because they have used this exact kind of method for torture in the past. I love history. I thought actually before I was going to be a pastor that I would be maybe a history teacher or a history professor one day. And so during World War II, I learned this recently that they had the Nazis had a really big problem. And that was when they were taking POWs, prisoners of war, and they were putting them in camps. All of the POWs were trained to be soldiers and trained to fight. So when they would put them in there, the only thing that they could ever think about doing was getting out of the camp and trying to escape. And so they were constantly having to put down these rebellions one after another until one guy came up with this idea. And it was a great idea for horrible reasons. But this is what they did. And he went out into a field and he took a pile of rocks and he put them on this spot, this huge pile. And then one morning he brought all the prisoners out and he took them over to this pile of rocks and he said, "This is what we want you guys to do. We want you to take these rocks and we want you to move these rocks to the other side of the field. And we want you to put them right here in this spot." And so that's what they did. All day long, they spent their day taking the rocks and putting them in this pile. And then the next morning, the guy went back in and he took the prisoners back out to the field and he brought them to the pile of rocks and says, "Now I want you to take this pile of rocks and I want you to pick them up. I want you to take them back and I want you to put them in the exact same spot that they were in the day before, into the very indentions that they were sitting in." And before long, these soldiers began to lose their will. They began to no longer desire freedom. They began to no longer desire to want to get out of this camp anymore because they were caught up doing something meaningless and pointless. In fact, a lot of them started to go crazy. They didn't know what they were supposed to do with their life. They lost their meaning. How many of us are trapped here in our lives? How many of us have spent our 20s or our 30s or our 40s and our 50s and our 60s stuck in a career and trapped in a life that we no longer even desire to be a part of? We don't feel like we're doing anything meaningful. We don't feel like there's a point to our lives. There's no purpose to our lives. Do you really think that your God, Jesus, came and died so that you can live a life like that? The answer is no. If you feel trapped, then there's a good chance that you have probably disconnected from your godly purpose. You disconnected from what God wants you to be. And you no longer feel like there's a point to your life, and he's trying to show you what it actually is. So if I could plead with everybody in this room about one thing, it would be this: don't waste your life. Don't settle for a hole in the ground based on the fear of what might happen if you finally got out. Don't live your life based on a fear instead of based on the faith of what God is trying to do in you. But this is where Gideon was at, is he was down in this hole and he was letting fear control him. But here is where something really cool happens, and this is when God shows up. And in verse 12 in Judges chapter 6, it says this. It says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, look at this, look how cool this is. He said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon was in a hole in the ground, doing something completely pointless and completely meaningless. God shows up and says, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. He calls him a mighty warrior. I know that right here what God is saying is he's like, look, I know where you are and I know where you have been, but I see what I have created you to be. And I'm so thankful that when our God looks at us, he doesn't see us as a people that are stuck in a hole in the ground. He looks at us and sees us as he created us to be. And he looks at us and he sees what our potential truly is, that we are warriors and that we are not cowards in a hole in the ground. I dare you to ask God to allow you to see yourself the way that he does. Be ready, because it's going to be a scary moment when he shows you. In fact, it could be so scary that you might not even like it. But it's possible when he shows up. Number 2, God's plan is bigger than your imagination. Verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? This is a cool verse because God is talking to this guy. Okay, now he showed up and he's called him a mighty warrior, but he's still in a hole in the ground. And now he's telling him to go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. The entire nation of Israel has been oppressed by this nation. And he's talking to a guy in a hole in the ground and telling him that it's him. It is you that are going to get out of this hole and is going to save an entire nation. How scary of a moment must that have been for Gideon? This is what I think is so important for us to learn out of this verse. And that is that God will never call us into our comfort zone. He's never going to call you out of something and into something that just seems natural and easy, something that we can accomplish on our own. No, he's going to call you to do something that you can only accomplish with him. 1 Corinthians 2:9 says, however, as it is written, no eye has seen and no ear has heard and no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. God is working on something that is so much bigger than your imagination. So I want to go back to my barn story real quick. Right before I got out of the car, my mom, she looks at me and she says, Hunter, I hope you know how much God loves you. What she was referring to in that moment when I didn't realize right away was a verse. It's actually a verse in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 12. It says that, for the Lord corrects those he loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights. When my mom said that, it ticked me off, but I went inside, I went into my awesome barn, and I'm laying there, and God began to speak to me for the first time in a long time. And I'm laying there, and I'm thinking about this, and I remembered this verse, and I remembered what she was referring to, and I said, God, you're right. This doesn't make sense. Like, why am I in so much pain? How can you love me and I feel like I'm losing everything? It's because you do love me. And I realized in that moment it's time for me to get my life back on track. And so I still didn't have the confidence or the bravery to call my dad. So I did the next best thing. I called my grandma, Miss B. And she's sitting right down here on the front row. I love this woman. But I called her and said, Grandma, I've got to talk to you. Will you make me an omelet? Because I was starving. and she said, yeah. And so I went over. It was a Saturday morning. And I talked to her about everything that was going on in my life. Told her everything. And I went into a room and I prayed and I cried. And then the next morning I came to church right here at this campus. And I walked in through the doors for the first time in a long time. And I knew that people knew that I hadn't been serving God. And I knew that people knew that my life wasn't right. But nobody cared. I walked through the doors and people were so excited to see me. And they were giving me hugs and they were telling me how much they missed me and how glad they were that I was here. And I couldn't believe it. And I walked in and I sat on the front row and I listened to a sermon by my dad. And I don't really remember the sermon. I'm sure it was great. But the reason I don't remember the sermon is because of what happened after. I walked out of the sanctuary, out of those doors right back there in the back. And I walked into the foyer. And as soon as I did, I looked up and I started looking around the foyer at different people of all different ages. First person I looked at was an elderly gentleman. And my heart broke for him as soon as I saw him. I just realized, wait a second, I can pastor that guy. I don't know how. I don't know if he'll listen, but I can do it. And then I started looking, and I would look at an infant, and then I would look at a middle-aged couple and a young couple and young adults and teenagers and toddlers and every single age group. And everybody I looked at, my heart was breaking, and God was telling me, Hunter, I promise you that if you listen to me, if you finally surrender to me, if you allow me to show you what my purpose is for your life, I promise you that you will be able to pastor people of all ages, of all nations. I will be there for you. So I said, okay. I finally got enough guts to call my dad, and I did. I said, Dad, I got to talk to you. And I told him, I said, Dad, God's called me into ministry. I don't know if you believe me, but I know that he has. And I started a process of getting back into my relationship with God, and it took a while, but almost 2 years after that, I got a phone call from a pastor. He said, Hunter, do you want to pastor middle school students? I said, sure. God called me to pastor them. I can do that. And so I went and I pastored middle school students at our Greater Little Rock campus. And then not long after that, my dad said, Hunter, do you want to pastor high school students? I said, sure. I know that God's called me to do that. He promised me that I could. I'll do it. And I came to Conway. And I started pastoring high school students. But then one day, my dad called me into his office. And he asked me something that rocked my world. He said, Hunter, do you want to go be the campus pastor in Greenbrier? This is the coolest part of this story, because I started crying as soon as he asked me that. The reason I started crying is because that old country road that I got pulled over on, that barn, and that mattress were in Greenbrier, Arkansas. I passed that barn on the way to church every single day. God constantly reminds me of where I was without him and where I am with him. And the purposes of God far outweigh the purposes of man. And I am so thankful that I decided that day, those 5-6 years ago, that I was no longer going to listen to myself and fight for my own purposes, but instead, I was going to allow God to fight for me. And he has over and over and over again. Number 3, God's powerful plan will help you overcome your excuses. Judges chapter 6, verse 15. But Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Gideon is having this conversation with God. He's talking to God, and God, the creator of the universe, is telling him, I'm going to be with you. I've got your back. And all Gideon can talk about is his excuses. All he can bring up is, wait, no, you don't understand, God. I'm really weak, and my clan is weak, and my family is weak, and I'm the weakest one. And God's sitting there. What are you talking about? I just promised you that me, the God of everything, is going to be here, and I'm going to help you get through this. And if you don't get anything else tonight, I want you to get this. You are either going to define your life by your facts or by your faith. We have the choice. If we define our life by our facts, it's going to be miserable because our facts will never line up with what God is trying to do in our lives. If we define our life by our faith, that means that God is the only one that can make it happen. And that's what he is desperate to do in us. And we have to start defining our life by our faith and not by our facts. We're either going to say, but I am the weakest and I'm the poorest and I can't do this. Or I'm going to say, but no, my God is the best and the greatest. And whatever he says I can do this. And until you agree with what God is saying about you, you are going to struggle with your identity and you're going to begin to build your life around excuses instead of the faith that only God can give. Building a life around faith is way more powerful than building a life around excuses. This is what I want us to do real quick, just to make sure that everybody in this room knows that God has a plan for your life. If you're sitting next to somebody, I want you to reach over and I want you to grab their wrist. And I want you to check and see if that person's got a pulse. If anybody gets a negative, Bobby's ready to call 911. If you are alive, God is ready to use you. God called Abraham when he was 100 years old and told him that I'm about to start an entire nation through you. I need you to go down to Babies R Us and get ready. Abraham's immediately spitting out his excuses. Wait a second, you don't understand, God. I'm 100, my wife's 90. This ain't going to happen. Every time we spit out an excuse to God, I can just picture him sitting up there in heaven saying, do you not know who I am? I'm the God who put an interstate system through the Red Sea for my people. I'm the God who's brought the dead back to life and allowed the blind to see and the deaf to hear. Do you not think that I am big enough to get you through whatever your problem is? Number 4, my last point. God's promise is bigger than your problem. Judges chapter 6, verse 16. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all of the Midianites together. There are over 6,000 promises in the Word of God. That sounds about right, because that's about how many problems we're going to go through in a lifetime. But for every problem that you will ever face, God has a promise for you to know that he will be there with you through it all. I told you guys that God gave me a promise right here, foyer of this church, that if I were to listen to him and if I were to allow him to be in control of my life, that he would be there for me. And he would allow me to pastor people of all ages. About a year ago, just over a year ago, last January, Katie and I, our life was going amazingly well. We loved what we were doing. We were youth pastors right here in Conway, and I love being a youth pastor. It's like a party all the time. It's great. And then all of a sudden in December, somebody called or texted Katie out of the blue and said, hey, do you guys want to go to Israel? And we said, yeah, but I don't have the money to do that. And they said, no, you don't understand. We're going to cover your trip. Do you want to go to Israel? Yeah, we want to go. When's the next flight? Okay, we were so excited about it. And so they said, okay, we were going to pay for you guys to go. Y'all will go in January. And so that's what's happening. In the middle part of January, we're going to Israel. And then a few days before we leave, Katie pulls me into our room and says, hey, Hunter, I've got something that I need to talk to you about. I said, yeah, babe, what's going on? She said, Hunter, we're pregnant. And it was just like, oh my goodness, how can life get any better than this? God, thank you so much. Called my parents, called her parents, had them over for dinner, told them that they were going to be grandparents, and we're all celebrating and hugging in the kitchen of our house. The next morning we got up and we left to go to Israel. And on the flight over there, without getting into too many details, Katie had a miscarriage. And all of a sudden, we went from everything going great and nothing in our life being able to be any better than this to realizing, oh no, we're in trouble. We're about to be thousands of miles away from our friends and our family. We were on a trip with 60 people all over the age of 50 that we had never met before in our entire lives. We're used to youth groups. It's a little different. And we landed in the airport that night, and I don't know what to do. We called Katie's doctor, and she said, no, y'all should be okay. Y'all can stay there. But we're hurting, man. And my wife, she was hurting. I don't know what to do. We went to the hotel that night, and we went to bed, and we were both in pain. And the next morning, I woke up, and I felt like God asked me, he said, Hunter, are you going to remember my promise? Are you going to pay attention to your facts? Are you going to pay attention to the hardships that you're going through? Or are you going to remember the promise that I gave you? And right there on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, I told God, okay, God, I got you. We're going to do it. And there's been a lot of times in my life where I haven't gotten this right. But I think that this is one of the times where Katie and I, we got it right. And we walked out of that room and we decided that we were going to pastor those people. And we were going to do it with everything that we could. And for the next 14 days, we're in Israel hanging out with all of these people, and we're pastoring them and we're loving on them. By the time we left, they were trying to get us to come home and be their pastors. That was awkward, man. Their pastor was on the trip. It was weird. On the way home, on the flight home, when it was just Katie and I, she leaned over to me and said, Hunter, we could do this. We could pastor people of any age. I said, babe, I think you're right. I didn't know what he was doing in that moment. I didn't know that he was preparing us for Greenbrier, but I just said, okay. Then, not long after that is when my dad pulled me in his office and asked me to do it. And I knew in that moment that I could do it. But the reason that I knew that I could was because we had chose to stand on God's promises and not on the facts that we were facing in our life. And instead of looking at what we were dealing with and allowing the pain to take over, we decided, no, I remember how big my God is. And I remember that he told me he was going to be here for me. And we might not understand it right now, but he is working on something. And we went to the doctor, and they told us that it would be 3 to 6 months before Katie get pregnant again. And right after my dad asked me to be the pastor in Greenbrier, not 12 hours after that meeting, Katie walks me into the room and says, Hunter, we're pregnant. We started doing the math, guys, no joke. We found out that Katie got pregnant while we were in Israel. I don't for 1 second think that God caused that miscarriage to happen. But I do think that our God is big enough to turn any situation into his plan and into his purposes. And I'm thankful that our God is big enough to see through everything, and he never gets blindsided. And you might be going through something and you might not see a way out, but the whole time he is working on something, and his purposes and his plan will be fulfilled if you will let it. If you would, please bow your heads.